This presentation is on implementing patient access API. My name is Himanshu Chavda. I'm a customer engineer with Google Cloud's healthcare and life sciences team. So in today's presentation, I'll present end-to-end architecture and implementation pattern for health plan patient access API on Google Cloud to meet the ONC and CMS mandates on data interoperability. Some of the key topics that I'll cover is CARIN Blue Button and US Core implementation guides on FHIR server, transforming CPCDS data into FHIR, enabling API access to member data from Smart on FHIR application, and lastly, the consent management, provenance, and third-party application developer experience. So what is patient access API? CMS has published a final rule, which is around 475-page long document. In that document on page 54, each MA organization, which is Medicare Advantage organization, Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Plan, Qualified Health Plan, to implement, test, and monitor a standards-based API that is accessible to third-party applications and developers. So what data is supported for patient access API? There are three main categories of data that should be supported. One is the claims and encounter, which is highlighted in green. Second is clinical data, which is in orange font. And lastly, the formulary and drug, which is in orange, in the red font. So on the green, which is the claims and encounter, it's supported by CARIN Blue Button, which covers 9 FHIR resources, 40 value sets, 29 code systems. Clinical data is supported by US Core R4 implementation guide, which is 26 FHIR profiles, 31 value sets, 5 code systems, 1 concept map, and 4 resource extensions. And lastly, on formulary and coverage, which is covered by DaVinci PDAX formulary implementation guide, that covers 2 FHIR profiles, 4 value sets, 4 code systems, and 13 resource extension. And all this data should be accessible to the patient going back from January 1st, 2016. So back date up to 1st of January 2016, so which is 5 years worth of data. And data should be accessible to patient via and patient API through FHIR data model via an API access. So what we'll cover today is the 3 things. First one is, how do we prep our FHIR server to be compliant with implementation guide? So I'll show you that. Second, when the server is compliant with the implementation guides, how do we ingest the data and harmonize this data? And also, how do we map data into the FHIR resources? So I'll walk you through our architecture diagram on that. And lastly, the third-party application interactions, meaning if once the data is into the FHIR store or FHIR server, how does the third-party application developer can have access to the data and how they can write apps against it? So documentation on API and approval process that I'll show you in a demo. So first, let's cover the solutions architecture. So technology components that I will show you today is based on Google's healthcare products and Google Cloud Platform architecture. So here's what I'm showing here is an architecture overview of how do we ingest the data. So meaning data comes through via batch ingestion. It goes into a storage, which is in a cloud, Google Cloud Platform infrastructure. And once the data is stored in a storage, then we have a data harmonization suite that runs and extracts the data, which includes claims, payments, clinical data, whether it's via API or ETL or some sort of an interface engine. Once the data is extracted, then it transfers the data through mapping to the FHIR resources that are required by the implementation guide. So like CARIN Blue Button or DaVinci or US Core. So once the data is transferred to a specific implementation guide, we want to validate the data against the FHIR profiles and resource and value sets. Then we want to harmonize the data, meaning align data vocabulary, patient IDs, and remove any duplicates. Once the data is harmonized, we want to reconcile the data and create a blend that kind of put together, it gives the longitudinal information of a patient that's going back to January 1st, 2016, which is about 5 years worth of data. And lastly, once the data is reconciled into a single FHIR resource, which gives the longitudinal information of patient, the data should be accessible via REST API. So those 6 things that I mentioned you about, it's broken into 2 different categories, which is the harmonization suite and the healthcare API, which is a FHIR server. Then once the data is in a FHIR server, we want to have ability to secure the data and serve the data to the end user. So first is securing data by using enable OAuth 2 Open API Connect, OpenID Connect rather, and constrained by the FHIR resources access. So that also applies to the patient access API and the provider access API. And OAuth 2, an API proxy that enables data access constrained by smart on FHIR scope. So that's something I'll show you in our demo. So this talks about more on what does the data should be secure and served to the end user. Now, in order to get that piece, we want to have a third-party application or developer who writes an app. So for them, we have a platform which allows them to create a register an app and access the app backend data, and also gives them access to API documentation, so how they can write an app for given use cases. So first, I'll show you a server setup. So first, I mentioned that how do you set up your server to comply with the implementation guide. So in this case, I'm showing you a FHIR viewer browser that is part of our Google Cloud's healthcare API. This allows you to view the data inside the FHIR store. You can see it has this 6 implementation guide implemented, which includes US Core, DaVinci, payer specific, which is a payer directory, and also PDAX is specific to coverage, and also formulary. And lastly, it's a CARIN blue button. So in this view, I'm going into actually accessing a patient information from the FHIR viewer. So here I'm showing you all the list of patients that I have in my server, their test patients, and also what their JSON element looks like on each user, so each patient. So I'm showing you first test patient. It shows that the resource was created and was validated against this the implementation guide that are highlighted in the right side. So kind of in the metadata profile section, you can see what the data looks like or how the data was created in accordance with which implementation guide. So this gives you an idea of like setting up server with the right implementation guide. The second thing is, okay, once we want to set up the server to write validation piece. So before we get there, so how do you set up the server, the end-to-end architecture? So meaning data journey from source format to the FHIR format. How do you convert into FHIR format? So source format is a CSV file. And so it goes into 3 different stages. First phase is the staging of a data. So we want to stage the data for it to transform. So in order to stage the data, we ingest the data in a batch format and gets converted into ND-JSON format. So once the data is converted into ND-JSON, it gets written into the cloud storage, which is part of the transformation stage. So then it takes from the cloud storage, it runs to the FHIR mapping, and it writes the data into the intermediate FHIR store, which is the phase 3. It's a reconciliation. So the intermediate FHIR store, it writes all the data that's coming in, but it runs a reconciliation job to run the data against the final FHIR store to create a longitudinal record. And that data is written into final FHIR store. So when the end user accesses data, they have the view of their final longitudinal information of the data. And once the data is in a final FHIR store, it can be accessed via REST API. That's one part of the requirements. And also just want to highlight that all this data that goes through the entire pipelines and different stages gets logged into our provenance log, and also keeps the data lineage information as well, at what time, what happened to data, so you can have access to the data information. So this is a backend architecture of a pipeline. Lastly, I'm going to show you a demo of the actual API portal where I'll show you a logging into application as an app provider. Then I'm going to show you how a third-party application provider can write an app. And also, once the app is created, how does the user or member can access the data? So that I'll show you Smart on FHIR application demo. And all this is converted into registration approval process when application is created, and the plan member can enable or authorize their automatic approval or manual approval processor. So I'll walk you through on that. So first, let me go to the actual demo. So this is my demo site. So first, as an application third-party app developer, you get access to this application. So first, it shows you the entire all 3 different API calls that you can make, or you can write apps against. So there's a patient access API, provider directory API, and a Smart on FHIR API. So it gives you the information about what are the requirements walks you through at a different resource level and also gives you the idea about how to make a call against specific resource and what calls you can write against, and you can validate and test it. So this is the platform I was mentioning in my previous slide. Now assume that the app developer is writing an app and he wants to register an app. So first what he can do, or he or she can do, is go into My App section. You can register a new app by completing this form. When the form is completed and it goes to the plan member approval process, and then the app can be authorized, whether it's manual or automatic. So as soon as the app is created, I'm going to show you a Smart on FHIR app, which I'm going to launch from my browser here. First is I'm going to launch the app. Initially, I mentioned about the scope. So here's what the app, the plan member or the application provider can set their scope as far once the patient logs in, what kind of access would they have to access their resources. So this is what it means. So what I'm saying here is I'm going to assign patient to have coverage to read. They can have explanation of benefit, read access, and also patient that read, so they can read their own data. And once I run it, it's gonna launch a login page, which will direct me to a Google login ID. So this one right now I've configured with the Google identity provider. Where you can have your own identity provider as you wish. So first, I'm going to click on sign in, and I'm going to supply my credentials. Then once I supply my credentials, then I'm going to log in. The first it's going to do is going to ask me for my consent. When the page is loaded, you will see the request to authorize. So here, my ID is associated to this test patient called HEL307. And what it's saying, the application wants to have access to this level of resources where the application can read the data from the FHIR server. So as you can see, I'm going to click on agree. Then what it's going to do is going to first authenticate, and it's going to launch my data inside this Smart on FHIR app. This is an open source app, so it does not have a lot of bells and whistles, but I'm just going to show you the capability on how it's been integrated. First, as soon as you log in, you get an ID assigned to it, and you can see the token, and also you get which patient, and also the time expiration on the ID. And also, if you remember, if I said once I log in on identity, it sets the scope based on what I supplied initially, so what the patient is allowed to do. So once on this session, I can do this, read consent, look at my coverage and explanation of benefits. So in here, I can show you my EOB is pulled up from the FHIR server for my test patient, and also I can see my coverage. And lastly, I want to kind of point it to you like to the consent section. And here, I just enabled my consent. So I opted in to allow system to have my data and which device I use. And also it shows that which scope that I approved to system to have access to my data. So this kind of shows the understanding of consent, how it's captured and how it's compliant with the Smart on FHIR app. So here, so that kind of concludes our session today. Here's my contact information. You can reach me via app, or you can text me at Zulip chat, or you can email me. So now we'll chat in our Q&A session. Looking forward to have a good discussion on that. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that informative presentation, Himanshu, and that demo was especially helpful. We've been monitoring the Q&A box, and so far we don't have any questions posted. I'm just double checking. I'm going to give folks a minute or two to post now that they've had time to take in that demo. Are there any additional comments that you wanted to share in conclusion? As it does not look like we're getting any questions that are populated in the box here. Okay, well, it looks like there are no questions, and we really appreciate everyone's time. And you, as Himanshu mentioned, you can find him in the Whova app. He shared also his email and Zulip information, so you can contact him with questions. if you think of things now that you've had a chance to view his presentation. But we do wish to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and looking forward to more great sessions after this one. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.